Okay, I really want to thank all of you for coming here this morning. This is a wonderful place. To those of you who don't know this place, it's a little gem in the middle of Paris here on this island, which is distinguished by by a remarkable history, including Charles Baudelaire, who resided here for some years, and we are talking about. Le Fleur du Mal today, clearly. Those of you who are hoping for some answers in my talk, there will not be answers, there will be only questions. In this, I would hope that some of you, some of the speakers and maybe in the audience could provide some hints and some answers to this very difficult question. This is the kind of question which no sane academician can base his career on, and that nobody is going to get tenure, for looking at this. Clearly, it's a difficult problem, but I thought it needs to be raised. So, this is our topic: the brains that pull the triggers, and I think we have an extraordinary list of speakers from various disciplines, which I'm very grateful for your presence here. This is the third conference. You can see we have started a couple of years ago in that first meeting in 2015, and then continued last year, and this is the third one. And coming back to the history, so I will provide really a little bit of background, which I have provided in previous conferences, but I think in order to bring everybody to the same level of information. So in 1996, the Lancet has this editorial in which they summarized 1995. That editorial, they were complimenting a couple of Danish scientists for looking at the mouth of the Norwegian lobster, where they discovered some new phylum, okay, which they called Symbion Pandora. And the Lancet raised the question. I said, okay, but also in the last few years, we lost several 100,000 people by atrocities, by killings done worldwide, and yet science is really not dealing with this. So they sort of opened this Pandora box, and they called it Pandora and the problem of evil. The editorial was met with complete silence, except one angry letter from somewhere in England, which told them that this is the most insane editorial that they have written. But anyway, so I was thinking about this at the time, and obviously it's something that has bothered me for some time, because just looking at those repeating incidents with the same type of pictorial depiction, in Armenia in 1915, in Poland in 1941, in Cambodia in 1975, and then Srebrenica in 1995, in Rwanda in 1994, of course, and in Syria in 2014. And there was the issue which Saul Friedlander was referring to as the unease of historical interpretation. He said most interpreters try to avoid the problem posed by the psychology of total extermination by concentrating exclusively on specific ideological motives or on institutional dynamics, but an independent psychological residue seems to defy the historian. And he called it the unease of interpretation cannot but stem from the non-congruence between intellectual probing and the blocking of intuitive comprehension. And that's probably what we feel, when we see, unfortunate and horrific photographs like this, coming essentially over and over again. So In fact, he referred to it as a sense of uncanny, that it is indeed triggered by uncertainty as to the true nature of the perpetrators. Because there is really issue here of dehumanization of both victims and perpetrators, and movement into a sense of automata, where there is a question whether something is living or non-living, you know, which Freud referred to in his book, The Uncanny. So, but what I was trying to do is really not solve the problem of evil that the Lancet has brought up, but really concentrate on that particular interaction that happens. And it seems it defies really any explanation on a psychological, neuroscience, or even philosophical level. And this is exactly what Saul Friedlander was talking about. We really have historical interpretation, institutional interpretation. We don't really have psychological interpretation. So I decided to really approach it in a medical way and sort of define a hypothesis, which I call Syndrome E. And many people has asked me, very smart people ask you, what does the E stand for? But I said, you know, I'm not mentioning the E word at all in the paper, but I just want to deal with the transformation that happens in group of previously non-violent individuals as they become repetitive killers of the defenseless member of society. And I thought that there were some repeating elements that are present in this phenomena over the decades. And because I was trained, you know, as a medical person, I always sort of found the medical model useful to think about something that I don't understand. So I said, okay, let me look at it as a medical issue. So of course, it was fraught with dilemmas, of course, and we'll talk about it briefly. One of these is obviously the claim that we are entering the dangerous region of medicalization. But let's just deal with the phenomena. So there's the symptoms, okay? So at one level, we are dealing with the phenomenology, and we have with us in this conference, fortunately, we have some extraordinary individuals who have actually looked at the phenomenology, who were in the field, who talked with perpetrators, and who will give us this type of insight, which we really need, this type of information. But in looking at this, I thought that there was repetitive elements. One was a compulsive, repetitive violence. The individual engaged in stereotypic repetition of extreme violence characterized by compulsion to spare none of the victims, okay? I'm not going into details, but you will see that there are over and over the same type of description, the compulsion to spare none of the victim. There is a framework of obsessive ideation. Individuals are obsessed with a set of beliefs, often directed against a minority. There is perseveration. Behavior perseverates in face of changing circumstances. Failure, and there is a failure to adapt to changing stimulus reinforcement associations. I mean, all of you have heard about the death march at the end of World War II, as it was clear that the war is lost. You know, they were still trying to spare no one. Some of you may have heard, you know, about even when the Hutus were fleeing to Congo, they were still killing Tutsis on the way, repetitively, and trying to spare no one, even when it was clear that all was really lost. So there is no adaptation, really. There is no question that there is rapid desensitization to violence. Within a short period of time, most individuals undergo desensitization. And there is really diminished affective reactivity. That is, nothing is done in a frenzy and height of emotion. It is not the drunk, drunk wild people just doing havoc, but it's really sort of a flat emotional state. And there is another element which Friedlander actually has raised this, talking about hyperarousal. It is not really an affective hyperarousal. It's what he called rausch. It's a sense of elation with the number and totality of destruction. But there is intact intellectual abilities. You know, the planning is done, and especially in the efficient ways sometimes that we all unfortunately have heard about, how efficient the killing was, and this type of problem solving and abilities such as language and intellectual functions remains relatively intact. And then there is compartmentalization, and the individual conduct activities of seemingly conflicting cognitive states somebody may lead a normal family life, yet engage in killings of families. There is obedience to authority that we will talk about as an element. And there is something very important, the group dependency and contagion, and we will touch upon it. We have people really, who will talk about it. I'm sure that the J.M. Berger will talk about it, and Scott Atran will talk about it, and I think that Giacomo Rizzolatti is going to talk about groups also. And so I think we'll have a very interesting discussion here about this issue of group dependency and contagion. And I hope that James is also going to give us a little bit of his thought and expertise, really, on the changing milieu of contagion in the present era. With all, social media and the concept of the group may have changed, really, to something which is even more dangerous and risky. So, in the medical, model, I sort of said, well, the risk factor is male. I don't know if people would agree, but that's what I thought at the time. Age, where most of these perpetrators is between 15 and 50. Alain Berthoz is going to talk about the developmental issue and about this very young age when there is some vulnerability. There are personality factors which people tried to really bring forward the authoritarian personality. But there is also an 80 or 70% penetrance, meaning that we're dealing with something that there is very, very large susceptibility, at least according to phenomenology, which I will talk about briefly. And in medicine, we talk about differential diagnosis, okay? So there is a lonely serial killers, we don't talk about them. We're not talking about war phenomena in general, although these phenomena usually are more prominent sometimes during wars, but it's not like a killing in the frenzy of war. And the smallest unit of the syndrome may be 2 individuals or 1 individual who is on the internet now. I mean, what is really the smallest unit? I mean, in the second conference, we had a very detailed and interesting description of the Norwegian killer, who killed about 60 or 70 boys and girls in a youth camp based on some ideological beliefs that he had. So that was just one person, but was he alone or was he really in some kind of a virtual group? Okay? Now, the other thing which I read at that time, and it was quite a naive and general look at this, I sort of said this is really a disorder of neocortical development rather than sort of the primitive McLean model of the visceral brain that is unleashed from regulation of the upper centers. Okay, that's sort of the McLean, Freudian, whatever you want to call it, is not the primitive amphibian, which is lurking to jump out and we are holding it. On the contrary, it's a disorder unique to humans and perhaps some higher non-human primates, and really it is characterized really by a hyperactive, a prefrontal cortex, which is really unregulated by the lower centers, because obviously we don't see this kind of behavior usually in animals, okay? The model itself was that at that time I was influenced by the somatic marker hypothesis of Damasio, and essentially proposed, Damasio proposed this hypothesis that a mechanism by which emotional processes can guide behavior. And so somatic markers are really association between reinforcing stimuli that induced an associated affective physiological state, with the key structures being the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I mean, we'll talk about it hopefully in this meeting in some detail about how this frontal and subcortical mechanisms and connections and interconnection may at least help build some kind of a model here. And what I proposed at that time is that allegory, I would say, of a cognitive fracture. That is, there is some ceasing to generate emotion appropriate to images conjured by certain categories and stimuli. So the prefrontal cortex is functionally disconnected from lower centers. It doesn't get really autonomic musculoskeletal and endocrine substrate of emotions, okay? So there is, you know, maybe also this other concept that hopefully Molly Crockett will talk about, the aversion to harm, okay? And we just don't go in and sort of, we'll have some mechanisms which really stop us from doing this. So this is what I called at the time a cognitive fracture, but that was, you know, nearly 20 years ago. Affective and social neuroscience was really not existent. You know, and you know, seminal these discoveries were not there. I don't think I knew anything about mirror neurons at that time, right? So it was a long time ago. And then I was thinking at the time of prevention and intervention. I thought it would be effective only at an early stage. But I thought it would be relevant to recognize the symptoms of obsessive ideation, hyperarousal, group-dependent aggression, and then perhaps in smaller groups, whether it is in gangs or whether this syndrome can be on a smaller scale, isolation of affective individuals and small groups, a syndrome cannot propagate without contact between individuals, which may be different today, obviously, with the means of propagation have really changed. So, in the previous conferences, one issue was, you know, I sort of went out and challenged people. I said, well, you know, what about DSM-6? You know, when DSM-6 is out, maybe we should put it there. Of course, you know, people said, what, I mean, what are you talking about? You know, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual offers a common language and standard criteria for classification of mental disorder. So immediately people were pointing out overlaps with, for instance, antisocial personality disorder, which is really habitually violate the right of others without remorse. That's done in the syndrome, right? There was the issue of overlap with psychopathy and sociopathy. This was discussed actually in the second conference. We had John Desity here discussing some of his studies in psychopathy and, you know, doing MRI and having imaging and other data. Now, you could also talk about a conduct disorder. Now look how DSM-5 is defining a conduct disorder, a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age, appropriate societal norms or rules are violated, as manifested by the presence of at least 3 of the following 15 criteria in the past 12 months from any of the categories below, with at least 1 criteria present in the past 6 months. By the time you reach the end of the sentence, you're already short of breath, and then you're looking at 15 things that they point out. So some people have pointed out, with dismay, that DSM-5 to some extent is a dictionary, really, and it doesn't really, so obviously it is criticized on the basis of this. However, although the validity is in question, the reliability may be stronger because you do have sort of very clear criteria. So in terms of DSM-5 diagnosis, in addition to what I've already said, things which overlap are emotional impairment or alexithymia, you know, which is a known entity, reactive versus instrumental aggression. Here we're talking about instrumental aggression. And then, you know, the issue of the pseudo-psychopathic syndrome, which is related to actual brain damage in the orbit of frontal ventromedial. So obviously we'll hear about this in great detail from some of the speakers, including Edmund Roll. I'm looking forward to really hearing about this. And of course, the issue of overlap with obsessive-compulsive disorder. So when you're looking at DSM-5, you sort of see overlapping. However, I want to kind of present something which some of you may know, which is how can we go really beyond the DSM? Some people say, Tom Insel, that DSM is no more than a dictionary, and we need diagnostic approach based on biology as well as symptoms. Mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domain of cognition, emotion, or behavior. And we need to have mapping of the cognitive, circuit, and genetic aspects, and this will hopefully yield new and better targets for treatment. So it's a practical approach, which now has a name. It's called RDoC, or RDoC, Research Domain Criteria, okay? So we haven't discussed it in previous meeting, but essentially it is put out by NIMH, National Institute for Mental Health. It is a research framework for new ways of studying mental disorder, okay? It integrates many levels of information from genomic to self-report, okay? So to better understand basic dimensions of functioning underlying the full range of human behavior from normal to abnormal, so acknowledging a full range rather than black and white, okay? Uses psychological construct grouped into domains of human behavior and functioning. And those are what? Domains are emotion, cognition, motivation, and social behavior. And in fact, they have, what they call a method of study, units of analysis. Units of analysis are genes, molecules, cell, circuits, physiology, behavior, and self-report, okay? So looking at this from this point of view, that's what we will have in this meeting. We'll have self-reports and people who documented behavior, people who studied behavior in a more controlled fashion. We'll hear about the physiology at some level, about circuits. Dr. Rizzolatti is going to tell us about cells, okay? We'll hear about molecules because we talk about the pharmacology. Okay, so we'll deal with those levels. They have a sort of, we call an RDoC matrix. It's sort of getting more and more formal, which is a matrix which has domains on the one hand and unit of analysis on the other, and you start filling those, empty slots, and in this, I think you really gain better understanding. Currently, they have 5 domains: negative valence system and positive, which is really the emotional valence, cognitive system, systems for social processes, and arousal and regulatory systems. So I'm just pointing this as a methodology, and maybe when we think about the problem that we are facing, rather than look for DSM similarities or this, we should really approach it in this level, okay? So research domain criteria. We have genes, molecules, cell, circuits, physiology, behavior, self-report. In domains, we have emotions, cognitive, system for social processes, arousal and regulatory. How does it fit into syndrome E, okay? So the method of study will start with self-report, okay? And we'll talk about all these domains. We'll talk about the psychological construct that we will talk about, are dehumanization, and they were actually discussed in previous meeting. Dehumanization, which we'll talk about very early. We'll talk about emphasis. Several of the speakers will really talk about this issue. We'll talk about agency, which touches upon the issue of responsibility. I'll show you immediately how we will do it, okay? So in terms of the phenomenology, let's move quickly. We do have some self-report, which was documented by very serious people, such as Christopher Browning in the seminal book, Ordinary Men, about 500 men, 30 to 50, middle lower class, policemen, construction workers. They were taken in 1942, from Hamburg, and in a period of a short time, they killed 38,000 Jews. They transported over 40,000. And what Browning saw really is that 80% really opted to participate. There was, in fact, a possibility of not participating. There was no real punishment, okay? There was no battle frenzy here. This was done in an organized way. And really, at some point, you hear about what happened to these people. They just wanted to spare no one. They hunted down, single Jews that they escaped into the woods. There was this is where, this list of symptoms arises, okay? And the same thing in the book again, phenomenology or self-report by Jean Hatzfeld in Saison des Machettes about the Rwanda massacre, which was really a very high volume, high pace massacre. 10, if not hundreds of thousands of mostly peasant, many of them illiterate. Most of us have never killed, most of them had no record of criminal activity. They were mobilized. And again, there was no example of somebody who was arrested because they didn't want to really participate. But there was really a large number which really participated. I mean, and you hear the issue of self-report, okay? Things that people are telling, you know, Jean Hatzfeld or telling, told Browning, and probably are telling some of the people in the audience. And among the speaker, I gave him a machete, blow it at the neck level on the vulnerable vein. It came to me naturally without thinking. He fell without shouting, without moaning. I felt nothing, just let him lie. Since I was killing, often I began to feel it didn't mean anything to me. It gave me no pleasure. He became more and more cruel, more and more calm, okay? It's really not a frenzy thing. That's, and with the ordinary man, that's a concept that really, Browning brought in and sort of really communicates to some extent with the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about. But he asked a very question: why did most men in Reserve Police 101 become killers while only a minority, and certainly no more than 20%, did not? This is a question. And you know, this type of ordinary, you know, this thing is coming over and over again in the Bataclan. You know, we came face to face, but he didn't shoot. What did he look like? An ordinary guy with the Kalashnikov. This is what we're seeing. Now, of course, we may hear different views. The question that we will deal right now in the beginning by our first speaker is going to be that very, very question by Abraham de Swan, who will really look at this ordinary, how ordinary are our ordinary perpetrators, okay? So, and indeed, you know, one issue in this interdisciplinary dialogue that we felt very strongly in the first meeting here, because we have some social psychologists who really had a hard time communicating with biologists, okay? Because in social psychology, there is a strong tradition of context, okay? Not so much mechanism, but context. And the issue is just context that, you know, an ordinary man can find himself in, and that's what he does. But, of course, Scott Atran is going to tell us about devoted actors. And we're going to hear, you know, about this, the self and the group, and we will challenge maybe this issue. I'm not going to go into the Stanford Prison Experiment, which was just really a way to maybe stage a similar scenario where people were randomly assigned to guards and prisoners and phenomena of cruelty and some of maybe of the symptoms that I have described became clear in that. That's the word of Zimbardo, controversial, but just an attempt to really do this in the lab, which is very difficult. But what is rather seminal in this history is a Milgram experiment, and I'm mentioning it because I will tell you immediately how Patrick Haggard, who by the way is also a fellow here, took this and told us last time about, you know, his modern version of that. But in the Milgram experiment, as you know, people were administering electrical shock to suffering individuals, you know, by the order, you know, of the experimenter. Okay, of course, this was a situation where the poor subject didn't know that he was really being conned, which really, you know, nowadays, it really placed a sort of a limitation, an ethical limitation. But, you know, there is apparently a whole literature which I'm not familiar with in social sciences about the various contexts in which the Milgram experiment was done, and there were many versions, and it was really a topic of great discussion. But I'm mentioning it because Patrick Haggard, you know, who many of you probably know about, in University College of London really tried to redo the Milgram, but he had a problem. First of all, his own ethics really didn't really permit him to really do it. So the idea here was that the experimenter and the subject, I mean, the guy who was administering the shock and the guy who received it, eventually changed roles, and it was really not done in a deceiving framework. But the variable which he used is really having a person there. This is this woman which you can see actively instructing shock or don't shock, and then a situation of free choice where this lady is sitting on the side and really not intervening. And he is a very clever experiment which was published in Current Biology last year, where there is really a measure of agency, meaning that period of time in which the action is done, okay? Period of time as assessed by the subject himself. And the subject himself has a different assessment, that is actions that are done by coercion, by an instruction, were really assessed as being faster really than actions being done without coercion. So this was an objective measure of agency. And indeed, he showed that this measure was different in the coercion situation compared to the other. And he even had a physiological measure, which was really the N1 peak of the evoked potential to the tone, really, and that served as a physiological measure, which was different in those two conditions. So the conclusion is that the coercion reduces intentional binding, and it really reduces the sense of agency. You don't feel like you are an owner, of your own acts, which to Patrick, well, what it really means is that really people often claim reduced responsibility when only obeying orders, but they may also experience this sense of less responsibility, because that psychological construct in our framework that we're looking at things now, that psychological construct of agency can be measured and maybe has also a physiological construct, a physiological measure, which is the amplitude of the N1 potential. And what Patrick is raising is a question whether societies and systems can manage the sense of agency and attribution of responsibility. So again, this is a very difficult topic, and it's done here in a creative way, using an old paradigm which has been resurrected. So the other psychological construct that we wanted to discuss, and we have discussed it in the previous setting, is the issue of dehumanization or dehumanized perception. And is it really a psychological means to facilitate atrocities, torture, and genocide? Now, we're very fortunate to really have Susan Fisk, who's really a world authority on this topic at Princeton. Unfortunately, Dr. Fisk had some issue which prevented her in the last moment from attending this, but she was gracious enough to and will be here, on auditory Skype. She will see us, but we won't see her because it is 5 a.m. on the East Coast. Yeah, we're getting to the end here. So the issue of dehumanization is really a change in perception. And that's, I think, what people need to understand. And Dr. Fisk was really instrumental in the sense that she was able to cross the boundaries between social psychology and neuroscience and really try to look at it, from neuroscience perspective. And just an example of this is this paper which I mentioned occasionally just a couple of years ago about the neural correlates of justified and unjustified killing. It was an FMRI study done in Australia. What was interesting is that people were playing video games and they were shooting in three conditions. They were shooting at civilians, they were shooting at soldiers, and they were shooting at objects. And the classical fMRI studies, they take one condition and they they subtracted from the other. So when you look at the fMRI, the bold activation of civilians minus soldiers, really, what was interesting that they had in this lateral orbitofrontal region, that Dr. Ross is going to tell us about, activated means perhaps, a sense of guilt. I don't know. Edmund may want to comment on that. To me, what was much more interesting was that activation in the posterior part, you can see here in the temporal lobe, which means that really the area of faces was activated, meaning that really you are affected at the perceptual level, which is rather early, really, at the perceptual level, before decision-making is made even, you're already affected by this process of dehumanization, which has a clear physiological correlate. The other psychological construct that we have dealt with and will deal with is the empathy. I mean, to bring a radical view, a Simon Baron-Cohen view that the science of evil is basically all hypoactive empathy circuits, empathy shut down. But we had, different views expressed here. We had Emile Bruno from MIT last time, who talked really and demonstrated the incredible difference between in-group empathy and out-of-group, completely opposite behavior. Okay, so the empathy is very much dependent on group structure, and John DeCity was really pointing out the vulnerability and the fragility of that concept of empathy, which evolutionary, it is important in order to keep your group, but it can result in a completely opposite attitude for an external group. And perhaps, toward the end of this presentation, we're going to just point out to this structure, which I don't really have time to talk about, but all the structure which are involved here, the prefrontal and subcortical mechanism, which cannot even be put in a single slide, but you can see the structure that we'll talk about, the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal, the amygdala, the striatal, and the basal ganglia mechanism. And we're really talking about several contrasts here. One is the issue of goal-directed versus habitual automatic activity, which is, here it's modeled, in Grabel's and Grabel's work. And then the issue of rules versus values, juxtaposing the lateral prefrontal cortex with the medial prefrontal cortex, rules versus values. And here, work which was done by Etienne Koechlin here was presented last time. And perhaps, one last point is really, it was a very interesting talk by Trevor Robbins last time, pointing out this issue of pharmacoterrorism, to use that term by Fond and House, which is, eyewitnesses have described how some of the Bataclan killers were zombie-like during that siege, and syringe thought to have been used by gang before the Paris attacks were found inside the hotel rooms, okay? And what was really suspected was really the terror potion, which is apparently including Captagon counterfeit tablets, which has essentially amphetamine component in it. So the production of CCT has been increasing in recent years, particularly in areas such as Syria, where they're active. According to the World Customs Organization, the amount of Captagon seized has increased from 4 tons in 2012 to 11, okay? So, Captagon is essentially an amphetamine, with theophylline, and methamphetamine will cause certain of the symptoms that I have described to you. And Trevor really went into detail how it will induce aggressiveness, but at the same time, something similar to alexithymia, meaning that flatness of emotion. And indeed has been shown to show reduced ventral inferior frontal gyrus activity, which could indicate lower emotional regulation, and in turn may contribute to heightened aggression. So this issue, whether there is really a molecule or drug model where some of the symptoms of syndrome E can be induced by neurochemicals or pharmacological agents is really important, because it may point out to mechanisms really by using this, and perhaps one of the only evidence of a causal relationship really, not just a correlation, but really a causal relationship. So we will have some talks about it. We'll have Norman Ohler with us tomorrow, who wrote this book Blitzed. He's going to talk about the use of drugs in the Third Reich and the use of amphetamine, which was over-the-counter drugs before World War II. Of course, we're not explaining everything by it, but it's a very interesting observation. In addition to the Nazi leadership, it was a wide use of that, both in the population and in the army. And we will hear Professor Tassin, who will talk to us about this issue as well, bringing in basically both the catecholamine system and the serotonergic system. And we will have several speakers also. Hopefully, Molly Crockett will talk about, the effect of serotonin on various morality situations that we have. So we have very interesting things waiting. And Trevor really raised this question: can syndrome E potentially be understood in terms of unbalanced or disconnected corticostriatal or corticoamygdalar networks? Again, we don't have time to talk about it now, but we will talk about it during the conference. We have gotten some attention. Nature has written an editorial and has, after our first conference, has called this transformation the kill switch. And again, pointing out, yes, there is an interdisciplinary dialogue, and hopefully we will continue at this time. So what I want to do now, it takes 3 minutes. I want to do two things. I want to present a short video, which I presented already before, but it simply speaks for itself. And it's an Israeli reporter, Itai, who went to the battle zone there on the border with Kurds. He was with the Kurds guys who were fighting the ISIS, but there were some captives.
العليم السجار
فاعلموا أن لنا جيوشا في العراق وجيشا في الشام من الأسود الجياع شرابهم الدماء وأنيسهم الأشلاء.
اختصاصي قائد مجموعة 20 عنصر معي.
How many people did you kill? يعني كم واحد قتلت؟
والله كثير، لأنه ما أتذكر، كثير قتلت.
قتل بالطلقة ولا بالذبح؟
قتل طلقة وقتل ذبح.
أثناء الذبح بنجضع على جنبه، نوجه على جهة الجنوب، نقطع رأسه بالسكين.
القلب.
إيه.
أمين؟
نعم.
مشان ما خلصت كلامي. تكون السكين مو حادة كتير مشان يتعذب لما نقطع رأسه.
الله.
البقاع أعطيناه، يعني بس هجوم كان نهجم.
ما قطع رأس؟
لا. يقطعون الرأس ياخذ.
شفت حادثة تقطع حدا قطع رأس شخص؟
أي صح.
شفت؟ أنت نفسك عملت هاي العملية، قطعت رأس حدا؟
أي.
قطعت رأس كم شخص؟
في مقارب 70 واحد.
قتلتهم، قطعت رأسهم بالسكين كان
بالقوم.
بالقامة.
من الشريعة الإسلامية يعني.
قبل ما انتميتوا لداعش شو عملتوا بحياتكم؟
أنا ما كنت اشتغل شيء.
أبدا؟
لا، كنت قاعد بالبيت.
أمير؟
أنا كنت بالمدنية سائق، بعدين انضميت للجيش الحر، وبعدين انضميت للدولة الإسلامية.
نحن لما كنا جيش حر أول شيء طلعنا لنقاتل النظام، بعدين انضمينا لداعش وأخذنا دورات شرعية، درسونا وحسب ما فهمنا أنه الأكراد كفرة والمسيحية نصارى وحلال قتلهم ولازم نقتلهم كلهم.
طلق كم واحد تقريبا وذبح كم واحد تقريبا؟
والله قتل طلقة شيء 10-15.
والذبح كم واحد؟
5-6.
كلهم كانوا أكراد؟
أكراد ومسيحية وعرب مشكل.
مرات كنا ناخذ حبوب. إيه يعني في مرات لما تاخذ الحبة ما بتعرف شو بتعمل.
حبوب هلوسة
يعني بتقتل الناس كثيرة من دون اللي متذكرهم أنا من دون الحبوب 3 بس اللي لما باكل حب ما بعرف.
How did you feel when you killed the people? You felt good?
ما عدم مبالاة.
Okay, so the basic question we have is how do ordinary individuals become capable of undergoing such extreme change in behavior? And can neuroscience dialogue with the human and social sciences lead to a new insight? Could there be a relevant biological model? Can we develop a research domain criteria approach here? And then can anything be done to meet the challenge of prevention and containment?